So welcome to the webinar. This webinar is Turn Up the Volume on Social Justice in New Mexico. The webinar is sponsored by the Center for Media Justice and the New Mexico members of the Media Action Grassroots Network. Some of these organizations include groups like Media Literacy Project, Encuentro, and Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, and quote unquote. Today we'll be discussing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a radio station, and I'm really excited to share some of that information to you all. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. I apologize for my name is partly cut off. My name is not Stephen Rendera. It's Stephen Renderos with an S. But my name is Stephen Renderos. I'm the national organizer at the Center for Media Justice. In that role, I coordinate the national campaigns of the Media Action Grassroots Network, of which one of those campaigns is doing outreach to community groups about this opportunity to build new radio stations. I've actually been a community organizer for the past 8 years, though that's partly what qualifies me for this conversation. My real credentials are in the field of music. I've actually been a DJ for the past 10 years, mostly performing out of Minneapolis until my recent move to New York. A couple of years ago, alongside my DJ partner, Miguel, I created a radio show called Radio Pocho at a community radio station in Minneapolis. So this is me and Miguel hanging out. We did a radio show together, and for us, we were kind of driven to produce this show out of a level of dissatisfaction with the variety of music that was on the airwaves, and plus, what was on the air actually didn't really reflect our background. We were two, Latino guys who'd grown up listening to cumbia and funk, soul and salsa. We wanted a show that could reflect that musical upbringing, and so I was able to get my show at my local community radio station. But I'll be honest that it actually wasn't easy. When the time slot opened up, they actually received about 30 applications, and luckily ours was the one that got chosen. But enough about me. I actually want to take this moment to find out who else is on the call. And by way of introduction, I'm hoping folks can say their name, what city you live in, and the intro question is, where do you get your news from? So anyone can feel free to dive in, name, city, and where do you get your news from?
This is Rosita Avila from Media Literacy Project. I typically get my news from the internet, and I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Excellent. And if you're trying to talk, you may be on mute. So name, city, and where do you get your news from?
My name is Tanya Covington. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm with the New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty, and I'm the Racial Justice Director there. I generally get my news from radio and internet.
I'm Melissa Harris. I'm with Generation Justice here in Albuquerque, and I get my news through the internet.
I'm Donna DiBianco. I'm with Common Frequency. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I get my news from the internet, radio, and TV.
Excellent. Anybody else?
My name is Sue Skirman. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I get my news from the internet and TV and radio and newsprint.
Excellent. All right, I think that might be it in terms of other folks unless I missed somebody. So I'm going to have you kind of keep that in the back of your mind, the places that we go to access our news, because it'll be relevant for a discussion we'll dive into in a second. So excellent. So for today's webinar, my goal is to have you each walk away with a couple things: a solid understanding of the LPFM radio opportunity, and also to share some resources that may be helpful to you all as you think about potentially starting an LPFM station in your community. Just judging by some of the folks that are on the call, there's a wealth of knowledge already in the room. I know some folks were at the Grassroots Radio Conference last year. Other folks have been involved in radio for a long time, so certainly at any point, feel free to chime in and add into the discussion. So as I was mentioning, I work at the Center for Media Justice. We're a national movement building intermediary. We exist to strengthen the communications effectiveness of grassroots racial justice sectors and to sustain a powerful local-to-local movement for media rights and access. The way that we build this movement is actually through a national network that we call the Media Action Grassroots Network, or MAGNET for short. We have over 150 members across the country, and our network's efforts in New Mexico are led by Media Literacy Project, whom you all are very familiar with. Through MAGNET, we are helping to spread the word about the low-power FM opportunity, which I'll speak to in a little bit, and we're doing that in partnership with groups like Prometheus Radio Project and Common Frequencies involved in that effort as well. Before we dive into that, I think it's important to get a sense of the media environment that's kind of present in this community. When I was coming up as an organizer, we used to always say that we should start with where people are at, and I think I mean that both literally and figuratively in this discussion. So I'm hoping we could chat briefly about the media landscape in New Mexico and what that media landscape is like. So I wanted to just kind of open this up for a discussion, just to kind of popcorn answers out. You know, how do you feel about media coverage in your community? Is it reflective of your community? Is it reflective of your experience? Just generally, how do folks feel about media coverage in your local community?
This is Rosita. I would say one of the things that happened in Albuquerque is we no longer have a public access TV. So that was something that really changed. And then limited community radio. There's a few stations out there that cover things like Generation Justice, and then there's a couple of shows on KUNM that seem to cover what's going on in our community that affects us.
Cool. So there's some community-based media that helps to provide an alternate perspective. How do other folks feel?
This is Sue. So much of our local TV news is ambulance chasing and basically a list of crimes that have occurred in the last, since the last episode.
And how do you feel about that coverage?
No, it's totally inadequate. It leaves out so many stories that ought to be told, negative and positive, and or they might cover a story that's important, but they don't talk to all the relevant people they should be talking to. They might just be talking to, powerful politicians and not the people that are impacted by, say, legislation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's huge in Santa Fe as well. Santa Fe is one of the best kept secrets media-wise. We're the state capital, and the coverage is minimal out here.
Mm-hmm. And what impact do you feel like that has in terms of people being informed?
Well, an informed society is a more responsible society because they can make informed decisions. And so, people follow things blindly around here, I think. We have, which I also get Albuquerque information, and, we have some investigative journalism, but again, it's the big stuff and not the little one. We have like Larry Barker Investigates, which is pretty good. I mean, he's pretty good, but it's for the masses rather than some of the individual opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
Going off of what Sue said is that it definitely our local media definitely focuses on the negative aspects of New Mexico, and you can definitely see that in people's, ideas around what it's like in New Mexico. And so I think that is something to really keep in mind, that there's not the positive stories, there's not the local stories, or stories about people and how well things work here.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think when I started organizing, I did a lot of organizing in manufactured home park communities, which a lot of folks know them as trailer parks, but in Minnesota, where I was living outside of the major urban area, manufactured home parks were the only source of affordable housing in rural communities, but there was such a negative portrayal of those communities. It seemed like the only time that those communities ever made it to the news was when there was a drug bust or there was, some sort of a crime going on. And I mean, I saw it in my work in terms of how it impacted what I was doing. It was a lot easier for communities, for developers to say, we're going to demolish this and build something completely different because it's, it's blight, it's negative, and it has all these, it has all these kind of bad things associated with it, when in reality, the majority of folks were homeowners. They were low income, but they were homeowners, and they were able to, to have a community in that sense. And so yeah, I think the way that the media tends to kind of focus on the negative was definitely something I saw on my end, and the impact it had, not just on people's perceptions, but also on policy. And I think that's right on. Yeah, I think the sentiments that folks are sharing, are generally shared by most people. There was an interesting poll last year. It was done by Gallup that, basically demonstrated that 60% of the people have little to no trust in the information that's coming out of TV, radio, and newspapers, which is pretty astounding when you consider, as Donna was mentioning, the role of media, of having an informed society. Like we should be aspiring towards that.
Wow.
And I think part of the reason that there's a level of dissatisfaction is that it feels like more and more nowadays there seems to be a consolidation of ideas. There really isn't that kind of multiple perspectives. And, one could argue that heyday never existed in media, but I think multiple perspectives is really missing from today's media environment. And I think a big reason why that exists is that we have an immense amount of consolidation happening. I'm sure that folks have seen on the news just it seems like every year we have a big media merger happening. We had Comcast, NBC a couple years ago. We had an attempted AT&T T-Mobile merger last year. A few years ago we had, what did we have? We had GE buying out someone else and so forth and so forth. It's just immense how much of our daily media, especially the daily media that we consumed, is owned by a select number of corporations. And, part of the adverse effect of all of that is that, the worst part of that is that there seems to be a lack of diversity and ownership. So a colleague of mine, Joe Torres, who I'll speak to in a little bit, was doing an analysis around the diversity and ownership and found that only 3% of TV stations and 8% of radio stations are owned by people of color. Which is pretty astounding considering that people of color make up about 35% of the U.S. population. Among women, that's even worse. You have women own about 5% of all broadcast stations, and women make up a very sizable chunk of the U.S. population. There was actually a report that was released last year by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, last October, that looks at diversity and ownership, and actually found that since the last time that they did a similar study, the ownership stats among women and people of color was actually on the decline. It wasn't getting any better. So what's happening is that the people who are creating the media look less and less like the people who are consuming the media, and that's extremely problematic. So Joseph Torres, he works at Free Press. He's also a board member at the Center for Media Justice, co-wrote a book with Juan Gonzalez from Democracy Now! Last year called News for All the People. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. It was a New York Times bestseller, and it looked at the role of race in U.S. media. And what was interesting is he didn't look just at, how blacks or Latinos and others were represented in the media. It also looked at how communities of color owned media and what that history is behind that, and also how the government played a very vital role in helping diversity ownership, and in many cases doing the opposite thing. He actually started out as a journalist and then became a media activist after kind of living in the belly of the beast and seeing what it meant firsthand to be part of mainstream media. And he explained part of his motivation behind writing the book was this idea that other people tell our stories, they often get it wrong, and this causes great harm to our communities. And this is a need, actually, that is shaped by a historical necessity. In the book, Joe tells the story of the Freedom's Journal, which is the first African-American newspaper founded in New York City, the city I'm currently living in, back in 1827. In the very first edition of the newspaper, they basically say their mission. They say, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. From the press and pulpit, we have suffered much by being incorrectly represented." And I don't know you, but I certainly feel like those words are still true today. And we need to plead our own cause through our own stories and our own media because we suffer greatly when others get to tell our story. And so this is actually where LPFM comes in. So remember a little bit ago when I shared some stats around diversity of owners in media? Well, these stats have been so bad for so long that back in 2000, the Federal Communications Commission established the Low Power FM radio service, which are basically non-commercial radio stations that operate at a maximum of 100 watts, or to kind of translate that, in other words, this is a radio station that has a reach of somewhere between 3 to 5 miles. It could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less, depending on a variety of variables, but that's generally what it means, 3 to 5 miles. So they don't have the reach of a commercial radio station or a full power radio station, but they would have allowed hundreds of new radio stations to get on the airwaves. So this was back in 2000. This victory, however, to kind of expand the airwaves was short-lived. There was a powerful broadcast lobby that convinced Congress to pass a law that would only allow the FCC to grant these licenses in rural communities and place some very damaging restrictions on where these frequencies for new stations would be located, on the radio dial. And once they passed that, it basically meant that, the impact that we had thought about, hundreds and hundreds of radio stations, all of a sudden that opportunity really dwindled. But over the next several years, a coalition led by Prometheus Radio Project would fight Congress to reverse that decision. And finally, in December of 2010, they were successful in getting the Local Community Radio Act passed. Prometheus and other great groups like Common Frequency did a phenomenal job of putting together a very interesting coalition of groups that, included conservatives, progressives, even right-wing churches and lefty unions. They all supported this idea. Their biggest opposition during this effort was actually the National Association for Broadcasters. And the picture here is a public action that took place in D.C. Outside of their offices, where activists, led by Prometheus are asking them to stop making them jump through hoops. And it was a pretty cool creative action. I'm pretty sure that they'd never seen anything like that. But Congress passing this bill, this Local Community Radio Act that was finally signed into law in 2011, meant that the FCC finally had the opportunity to fulfill the original intent of low-power radio, which was to put this in the hands of communities that represent diverse voices that are not reflected in the airwaves. So you might be thinking, we live in the digital age, so why radio? There are a few unique advantages that radio has, and I'll list 3. It's accessible, affordable, and best of all, local. So Prometheus likes to share the stat that 90% of people in the U.S. listen to radio at least once a week, and those that do, get to do so for free. My family, they actually live in Los Angeles. I grew up in Los Angeles. They're all immigrants from El Salvador, and I can tell you that my mom especially listens to the radio every single day, and she has hardly ever touched the computer, but she will not miss her favorite morning show. And for my mom, that's like her Facebook. That is her social network, is getting to listen to those, to those shows. So the last thing I want to say about radio, especially with low power FM, is that it's hyper local. more and more media content that we consume isn't actually being created in our communities. And so there are some devastating consequences when we don't have the media platforms to share our stories and to communicate. And there's a lot of countless examples of places where, because the radio station has been consolidated by a Clear Channel, there no longer is, someone to pick up the phone in that local radio station and during emergencies. And there's been a lot of examples in which, they haven't been able to get the information out as quickly as possible because of that. In other places, I know in South Texas, this is true, there are a few TV stations where all of their quote-unquote local news is actually not even produced in that community. So, local news about what's happening in the state legislature or what's happening with the local park, none of that information is being covered. It's actually all being pre-produced outside of those communities, and in some cases outside of that state. So it's pretty shocking what's happening with media, but the advantage to radio is, and especially low-power FM, is that it has to be based in that community, and so the opportunities for local content are really good. Actually, when I was in Minneapolis, right before I left, I started bringing groups together to think about the potential of a community radio station when I first heard about the LPFM opportunity. And we actually went through a visioning exercise to answer a variety of different questions. Some of them were like, what could we accomplish in our community if we had our own radio station? What values would we want our radio station to uphold? What would be different in our community if we had the ability to tell our own stories? Collaboration was an extremely important theme for us, and it came up a lot because of our diverse communities and how they often felt disconnected even though we lived right next to each other. We knew that a radio station was, for us at least, much more than just a place for someone to play jazz on Sunday morning, even though that's important. It could also be seen as an anchor that we could use to help rebuild our communities. And here's a slide of folks, getting together, being a part of a neighborhood parade. And this is, the interesting thing is we started organizing this last September. And we know where the radio station might be located, where the studio might be located, but we don't actually have any infrastructure. And so we're just out there we decided to get out into the community, make our presence felt, talk to folks about this opportunity, and get folks involved in the process of putting this radio station together. So that was exciting, and that's been exciting. They're still doing amazing work. So I also wanted to share an example of a radio station that operates as much more than just a radio station. If any of you had a chance to go to the Grassroots Radio Conference last year, you had a chance to visit the Champaign-Urbana Independent Media Center. This is a building which is owned by them, in which they operate a radio station. They rent out office space. They have a bike co-op. They have meeting space. They have a technology center. And they're even working to build a broadband network that would provide some relatively fast internet at a fraction of the cost of what some of these other companies would charge, like Comcast, Time Warner, and other folks. So they're doing a lot, and the radio station is simply just a piece of all these other things that could spin off through these efforts. It's not to say that every low-power FM station has to do all of these different things as well, but it's a way to kind of think about what else could we be doing as a community given this platform, given this opportunity. So I'm sure some of the questions for folks who are not as familiar with this process is how do we even get started? And first we kind of have to get to know what the rules are that will govern how the FCC will grant these LPFM licenses. And the FCC actually finalized these rules back in November of 2012, just a few months ago. And like any process in government, it could have either been good or bad. And I have to say that thankfully, the amazing efforts of groups like Prometheus and Common Frequency really helped to ensure that these rules would create the minimum amount of available licenses and that the groups that actually needed them the most could access them. I won't go into the full details of everything that's in the FCC's rules. I wanted to give you kind of a snapshot of 3 key areas around the rules. So the first, I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking about eligibility. So who actually gets to apply for these low-power FM stations? The applicants have to be either a group, organization, nonprofit. They all have to be some sort of an organization that has an educational mission. Now, I didn't say that you have to be federally registered as a 501c3 because the only requirement the FCC has is that you have to be registered in your state, but you don't have to be a 501c3. Additionally, your board has to be made up of more than 75% of people who live locally, which the FCC defines as living within, a 10-mile radius or within 10 miles of the proposed transmitter location, or more or less, where is your radio station going to be located? They have to live within 10 miles of that location. And lastly, the other kind of eligibility requirement is that there has to be a frequency that's available in your area to apply for. So I'm sure that's the golden question. Are there frequencies available in Albuquerque and New Mexico? I mean, and the short answer is maybe. The short answer is probably yes. There are definitely frequencies that are available in Albuquerque. However, any application, probably any application of Albuquerque will likely need an engineering study that basically proves that your radio station or your frequency won't interfere with other signals on the dial. So any engineering studies can range, anywhere from $100 to $2,000, depending on how complex the study is. Plus, if you can find, oftentimes you can find someone in your community who has that skill set who might be willing to even, volunteer for that. But that's just a general sense of what it might cost. I took a look at the availability in Albuquerque through an online tool that's available on radiospark.org, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's called RFree, and it lets you search by zip code or by coordinates for your particular area, and found that there's about 7 potential frequencies that might be available. All, however, requires some level of study just to figure out, to make sure that there's no way that you would be interfering with someone else's signal. So a little bit about the application process, and we'll shortly get to a phase where you can ask questions and discuss. So I apologize for being long-winded. The FCC has tentatively scheduled October 15th as the date that they'll begin accepting applications. Now, because it's the FCC, that date is definitely not set in stone and can definitely change. So I'm not going to promise you that that's the actual date, but that's what they said they're going to do. Similar to the last time the FCC granted the LPFM licenses, they'll be evaluating applications based on a point system. And here are the things that they'll be giving out a point for. So there's a variety of different things that you can get a point for, and collectively, however many points you get, that determines whether or not you might potentially get a license. So if your organization has existed, for more than 2 years in your community, you get a point for that. And this is the organization that is applying for the license. So that's one caveat. If you pledge to provide, at least 8 hours of local programming, then you get a point for that as well. And local programming by the FCC means content that involves some level of local production. For example, there are shows that are delivered via satellite or over the internet. Those don't count. And I'm thinking, as an example, you can think about Democracy Now! Playing random music selections off of an MP3 player also don't count. But if someone in your local community decides to do a show on all the best pop songs from the 70s and 80s and calls it Crap from the Past, that would count as original content. The funny thing is, Crap from the Past was actually a real radio show. It still exists in Minneapolis. So the next point is actually for a staffed studio, and you can basically get an additional point if you can promise that the studio will be staffed for at least 20 hours a week. So wherever your radio station is located, if someone or a selection of people will be there for a collective amount of 20 hours per week, you can get a point for that as well. There's also a point for tribal applicants. This is a point that's awarded to applicants whose radio station will be serving tribal land. So it's actually a really good thing that the FCC decided to include this and prioritize applicants that are coming from reservations. And you can also get a bonus point if you pledge to do the local programming as well as staffing your studio 20 hours, at least 20 hours a week. So you get a bonus point if you're pledging to do both. Since the last round of LPFM applications in 2003, collaboratives or groups that apply together, so let's say a coalition of groups in Albuquerque decides to put in an application. Last time that the FCC did this, they actually used to give out a bonus point. That's not the case this time around. The FCC thinks that allowing what they call consortia to apply could open up the process for abuse, where an organization, just a bunch of organizations, just to make it seem like they're working with a whole host of people when they're not. So the FCC decided to take that out. And so when the FCC receives your application, it will go into one of two piles. And so let me back up for a second, actually, so as to not confuse folks. So essentially with this application process, they are looking at prioritizing groups who are coming from communities that don't have a whole lot of local community media that's available. And when your application actually goes into the FCC, it goes into one of two piles. One they call the singletons, and then the other pile they call the mutually exclusive applicants. And the singletons are applicants that are coming from communities in which no one else in that community is applying for the same frequency. So if you're the only person in Albuquerque that's applying for that frequency, you go into the singleton pile. The mutually exclusive folks are applications in which there are multiple applicants for the same frequency. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the applicants in the singleton file usually get processed quicker by the FCC, and applicants in the mutually exclusive pile are processed in batches, and that process can take up to several months to even years. I mean, they've been known to really hold on for a long time.
Years. Radio Austin. Radio Austin's a good example.
Exactly.
Jim Ellinger.
There's also, I think there's some that are still even pending.
10 years. 10 years for Austin. Yeah, it's crazy. It's just nuts. Jim, of course, is beside himself on it.
So this is where I think we have to think strategically about how applications go in. So my advice to groups who are thinking about applying is, you should really, on the front end, reach out to as many groups and as many people as possible to try to find out, who else is thinking about applying, and explore the possibility of just being part of the same effort. In the ideal world, you'd want to be able to whittle down the applications coming from your city to one, but that may not always be possible, though. And in a lot of cities, no one singular group is going to be able to start a radio station on their own, and so collaboration is going to be key, even if it may not necessarily be reflected in the official applications to the FCC. So, there are some groups whose only interest might be that they want to do a radio show. There's others who may want to support in thinking about, governance structures, others who want to support around technology, others who may want to just volunteer. So there's room for multiple groups to be part of this effort and multiple ways for people to be involved. But getting back to the FCC's application and point system, in the event of a tie, there's typically a fight to the death. And of course, I'm only kidding, but the FCC does have a tiebreaker process. In some cases, it will either be resolved through what they call timeshares, where multiple applicants from the same community can agree to share the license. In some other cases, it could be settled by having one of the applicants move to another available frequency in that particular market. So that's what the application process entails. As I mentioned before, collaboration on the front end of the application is extremely important. That's why it's great to know that in Albuquerque, a couple groups have actually already started doing that. So this is where I'd like to introduce actually Susan Sherman from Quote Unquote, who I actually had the pleasure of meeting Susan in Urbana last year at the Grassroots Radio Conference. And she's going to share more about the efforts that are ongoing with Quote Unquote and what you all have undertaken to spread the word around LPFM and some of the things that you're planning coming forward. Susan?
Thank you, Donna and Steve. Right, so my name is Sue Skirman with Quote Unquote Media Center. I used to be a trainer for Quote Unquote for 3 years until the contract was taken away this past summer in July. I'm wondering if everybody on the line is familiar with Quote Unquote. But we were the public access TV station provider for over 30 years. And now I'm on the board of directors, and Quote Unquote is part of the Digital Justice Coalition, along with Media Literacy Project and Generation Justice, Encuentro, El Centro de Igualdad y Derechos, and lots of other groups. There's like more than 14 groups that are involved. And we've been meeting, well, they've been meeting for a long time, but I've only been joining them since July. And at the last minute, Steve Ranieri, the executive director of Quote Unquote, couldn't make it to the Grassroots Radio Conference in Champaign-Urbana this, when was that? Some months ago. In July, I think. And I ended up going and learned a lot about how to start an LPFM station. So we've been meeting every month or two and trying to get organized around a grassroots community Burke radio project. We're excited about the opportunity, and we've started thinking about our messaging. We've picked a couple of different neighborhoods that we thought we might consider putting the station. In the Barelas neighborhood where Encuentro is based, where we often meet. It's a working class Hispanic neighborhood. And then also the International District, which used to be maligned as the war zone. So those are two potential neighborhoods. We've also talked about surveying those neighborhoods and doing it in kind of a fun way, creating a radio booth. That's kind of in the works. And we wanted to start a Facebook page, and we're working on messaging for that. David Cooper and Melissa were working on that. So we are, some of our strengths is Quote Unquote, if no one else wants to, Quote Unquote is willing to be the applicant. We've been around as a 501c3 for over 30 years, so when it comes to the point system, you know, we would meet that one requirement of a community presence for 2 years or more in spades. So, and then this Digital Justice Coalition, having 14 plus groups that are very well represented in terms of people of color, I think that's one of our strengths too. And then, but we do need more help than what we currently have. A lot of us are working full time, and this is a volunteer thing we do on the side. And so we do need more folks. We have to get more folks involved to make this happen. That's for sure. But we're excited about it.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. And to answer your question, it's 8 hours of local programming each day. But like I said, I think the local programming requirement that the FCC has, it's fairly broad. So I think a lot of things would entail that. So I think it's something that's definitely doable. So that's just to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Those efforts sound extremely exciting, and it actually touches on many of the activities that I was going to share in terms of, you know, what could be possible moving forward. So obviously it's February, and though October is only, you know, it's only a few months away, but it is 8 months from now. What can we be doing between now and October 15th to get ready? My advice, you know, and I'll boil this down into my favorite number 3. My advice is for folks to be doing 3 things, you know, producing, fundraising, and doing some visioning around your radio station, and I'll expand on each of those. You know, we can't really lose sight of why many of us are involved in this effort, and many of us care about communities being able to tell our own stories in our own voices. So you don't need a radio license to start doing that now, and I know some of the efforts that Quote Unquote has, rolling out over the next few months is planning on, capturing stories from folks out in the community. So that I would just add that there are a variety of ways to start producing content now. You can be doing podcasting. You can have people collect interviews with a voice recorder. You can even collect interviews on a smartphone nowadays. There are multiple apps where you can do interviews out in communities. There's a great app that I've been using on the iPhone that makes it super easy to just be able to, snap an interview with someone out in the community. And actually, when I was in the Twin Cities, we used the production aspect of our work as a way to hear more from the community about what they wanted. Like if you could start your own radio station, what would you like to hear on the airwaves? What kind of a show would you like to hear? And we use that as a way to collect information from people, do some action-based research about what folks want. And in that way, as you're kind of developing the vision for the radio station, you're being somewhat reflective or accountable to what folks are saying they want. There's also a lot you can be doing for a radio station, and amongst the most important elements to all of it is fundraising. If you need to include an engineering study as part of your application, you may also want to do some fundraising to be able to to afford an engineer's time. Additionally, you can be thinking about how much do you need to launch a radio station. The costs, to be honest with you, vary from very extensively. It really kind of comes down to what you want in terms of equipment and what your spacing needs are going to be, stuff like that. But I think those are all decisions that should be made collectively among the folks that are thinking about starting the radio station. Equipment, for example, for a radio station can range somewhere in the range of $10,000, but of course, a lot of that you can always opt to try and track down donated equipment. You can use open source software and other creative solutions that would help bring down the cost. There's this very handy-dandy fundraising toolkit that's available on the Prometheus website that I'm planning on sharing with all of you once this webinar is over. But it includes information on, putting together a fundraising plan, how to do membership appeals, grant writing and underwriting, just a variety of different things that folks can be doing now as you're coming together and thinking about a radio station. My last point is around visioning and what you want for your radio station. What will be the mission of the radio station? How will the station be governed? What kind of programming will be on the air? Visioning your radio station, I think, is a process that you can, like I was mentioning earlier, involve the community in. I think a lot of the activities Susan shared are exactly what you should be doing. The more you're able to get the community involved on the front end, the better. It'll make folks feel like they're actually a part of the process. Reminds me of actually what my organizing mentor used to say. He says that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I'm pretty sure that mainstream media makes us feel like we're on the menu, and we don't need to make the same mistake when we're building a radio station that we hope will serve the needs of our communities.
Steve, can I interrupt?
Yeah. Sure.
I just wanted to add that when I was talking about the Berkeley radio project, I neglected to mention a 2-sentence goal that had been worked out. If I could read it now. It's, and that's probably going to end up being part of our mission. But it says, our goal with the Radio Burke project is to connect voices through the radio airwaves in communities most marginalized and underrepresented in Albuquerque, New Mexico. As non-corporate media stewards, we want to elevate stories that mainstream media leave out.
That's excellent. I think doing some of that work on the front end now, too, is also very helpful for the application process. Some of this information is required when you're getting ready to put together the application for the FCC. And so, the more that you can do this now and have that kind of out of the way, it makes it easier further down the line. And the goals sound pretty good, sound very good. Here are just some pictures of folks that have been part of the Twin Cities community radio effort as well. This was probably one of the toughest things for me to leave when I left. I was really passionate about being a part of this effort, and we've managed to to get involved in a variety of different ways. We've done listening sessions in the neighborhoods that we were thinking about building the radio station, just kind of hearing more about what the issues were in those communities and how radio could be part of the solution for some of those issues. We did a lot of youth programming. We went out into elementary schools and did actually for World Radio Day, which is coming up in a few weeks here in February. We did an event at a couple elementary schools in the Twin Cities with youth, where we brought a couple DJs, local DJs, to teach the kids how to do actual DJing, and got them visioning for what kind of a radio show they'd like to hear on the airwaves. It was pretty cool. So I think there's a variety of different things that people can be doing, and I think the efforts that are going on with Radio Burke sound very exciting. But with that said, I wanted to just take a step back and move into questions from you all. So any questions or thoughts or comments that folks want to share?
Well, I would like to add a real good way that these groups and organizations can start working today, tomorrow, tonight, as soon as we hang up, in starting to establish a presence that there will be a community radio station is by starting an internet station to begin with. It is very cost effective. It's the price of a laptop and a microphone and a mixing board, and then getting in touch with someplace like the Stream Guys, or there's a couple of streaming servers out there that, like the podcast, Podbean. I would take note, Podbean is a free podcasting site that people can subscribe to, that can already start a presence of this, because it's very nebulous at this point of the game. Oh, we're going to have a construction permit and we're going to have all of that, and trying to explain that to people that are not in the media business, it's very difficult to explain to. So by creating a web presence, I like the idea with the Facebook page, I can help with that. But also the podcasting and webcasting is vital in the success of, number one, getting the application, because it provides more strength there that you've been established in a broadcast capacity or a media capacity. And then when you make the transition to a terrestrial station, you already have your listeners and some numbers, as well as some fundraising opportunities. So it makes the whole mission a little bit easier to get the radio station on the air if you get a web stream happening as soon as possible. And that's one of my recommendations.
That's great feedback. That's amazing feedback, and thank you for that. I wasn't, I didn't know that piece about how it could strengthen your application just by, being able to demonstrate some broadcasting capacity. I think that's right on. So thank you so much for that feedback.
Right. You develop your own natural rhythm by the level of interest, by the level of participants that will be coming out of the woodwork from the community. Again, the whole 15 minutes of fame is the first appeal, but the other appeal to it is that the station will already be established. You'll be able to overcome some of the hurdles that people that are not experienced in that discipline will unfortunately fail if they don't have that kind of practice happening now.
But didn't Carl Johnson do that in Silver City with Gila Denver's Community Radio?
Oh yeah, yep. And Radio Boise in Idaho, they were on the air. They were on the air for about 7 years before they got their terrestrial station. And so when I went up there to open them up, 3/4 of the people were already trained. So we just had to go over particulars. Right, we had to go over the particulars of, filing the appropriate logs and issues and programs, and the reporting of a terrestrial station, which made my work a lot easier because all I had to do was translate. That was it. So that is something I highly, highly recommend anybody thinking about starting a station. Start with the web streaming, and for under $2,500 you can get that up and rolling. That's a bake sale or a car wash, or family dinners. One of the things I see a lot happening, trending now, are house parties. People have wine tastings and gourmet kind of dinners, and everybody pitches in $25 a head and brings a dish, a fancy gourmet dish, and
cool.
You have some volunteer bands come in and play some music, and you have a marvelous little soiree for the cost of the electricity, basically.
And if you're willing to bring me out to New Mexico, I'll DJ your event for free.
You just want our food. But yeah, that's.
I'll bring a tortilla de patata.
Oh, well then I will ask my friend to help me with her empanadas. Oh my gosh, she makes the best empanadas. Oh, but,
nothing like food to bring people together.
Exactly, and food and music
there you go.
work wonderfully, and renting out that space. A station I helped in Ames, Iowa, Ursula's station, KHOI, they've been doing what they call porch stories, and it's like every Thursday evening. You come in and you tell your local, you bring a dish and you pay what you can, and you sit around and story tell. And of course we're New Mexico, we're the land of storytellers. I was like, okay, now how does this concept work in Ames, Iowa? I mean, I'm used to some of our famous storytellers, and sure enough, there were some great little tales to be told in Little Ames, Iowa, and sure enough, I mean, it was a good way to, number one, bring the community out, get them accustomed to having a public space for public discourse, and so once the station launched, they had total crews. They knew exactly where they were going and how they were going to operate, because they already had the community support and people showing up.
Hey Donna, are any of these kind of activities or stories, are they captured anywhere where folks could check them out and get inspired, or does that not exist currently?
I'm pretty sure if you got in touch with Ursula Rudenberg at Pacifica or at KHOI, Ames, Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
She really ignited, just lit the whole mainstream. This is Main Street radio, not mainstream radio, and she really lit the community on fire by doing things like that.
It'd be great to capture some of this, some of these examples, and put out even if it's just a one sheet, just kind of a case study of here's what this other community did, and it's creative, it's very doable, it doesn't feel overwhelming, and it's definitely something within a lot of folks' capacity to do, and so I think it'd be great to figure out a way to capture some of this information and share it out for other folks.
You're absolutely right. I put together a document, a creative document on how to raise funding for these kinds of things, and I sent it personally. I will check my files, but I'm pretty sure Prometheus has creative fundraising, and brownpapertickets.org
mm-hmm.
also has some good fundraising ideas out there.
Yeah.
that have been successful with radio stations. You know, the big thing that I've noticed in my 20-plus years in the industry now is with the economy the way it is, people want tangible. It's almost they want experiences rather than here. You know, the traditional KNME or you know any of your traditional stations out here like KUNM. KUNM is getting a little better with it. I've been watching them a little bit. That you know, membership drives, the face of membership drives are changing, and they're changing from here you give us $35 and we give you a book to here you give us $50 and you get a night at the zoo, and that kind of creativity. The tangible experience rather than just, you know, when you have a CD of some music. So the creativity behind that is limitless, you know. It's boundless. Anything from, you know, car washes to bar crawls. We did Treefort Music Festival up in Boise, which was a huge fundraiser for KRBX. And that was met with quite a bit of success, and it was this, you know, 4-day music festival with the total community getting involved, and so that really helped put that station on the map as well. So it's when you're thinking when you're thinking about how do we reach out to the community, you put a placard out in a blank, you know, in a Justice Center. Office space that we're starting an internet station, and people will start flowing in, and you can start creating these kinds of opportunities. You're limited by your imagination in that respect, but I think the first investment stations need to make, or potential applicants need to make, is think about their vision and their mission first. Get their governance straightened out, and then get that internet station on the air.
Love it. Thank you so much, Donna. I want to kind of give room or space for any questions that came up throughout the webinar. Anybody have any questions, burning thoughts that they would like to share?
This is Rosita from Media Literacy Project. The one question I wanted to ask you, Susan, was if there's any joint national efforts for fundraising?
There aren't yet, but I think it's, you know, one of the advantages of being a part of Magnet is that we have that ability to bring folks together. And I think, you know, because there are other Magnet groups that are involved in doing, you know, local-based organizing around LPFM, I think there's a real opportunity to bring some folks together to think about some creative fundraising solutions that we can do as a network to help to fund either equipment costs or even engineering studies or what have you. But I think there's a real potential for that. And you know, Donna was mentioning Brown Paper Tickets. They're a Magnet member. Sabrina's been very active in Magnet for a long time. So I'm certain that we could bring, you know, some of the folks in Seattle that are doing some of this work, the New Mexico folks, the Minnesota folks, and I'd have to dive in to see where the San Antonio folks are in terms of LPFM efforts, but I think there's a real opportunity to bring folks together and think about, can we do something collectively as Magnet? I'm not sure what those activities would be, but I think you know, a space for a conversation to happen, I think would definitely be worth it, and so I'll definitely commit to doing that and bringing folks together for that conversation.
Steve, there was also Francisco Flores, I think, in Phoenix or Tucson.
Francisco Flores?
I think that was his name. I met him at the conference.
And that's it'd be worth. I'll check in with folks I'll check in with Jeff or others at Prometheus and see if they've got a record of him. He might be good to connect with, and this kind of brings me to my last slide in terms of some next steps. Prometheus is going to be doing a Southwest tour in March, I believe, tentatively scheduled for March. And they're going to be hitting up places like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, I think are the 3 states that they're thinking about covering on this tour. And so for you folks, I would say that this is an opportunity to think about how you use their presence in your community as a way to do outreach, as a potential opportunity for fundraising. I'm certain they're going to have folks on hand that can help out with the more kind of technical side of the process. And so I think that's a real opportunity that I would just want to flag. That there's an opportunity to do an event locally with them. And we've, at Magnet, we've talked to Prometheus about supporting a couple events in cities where we have members, and so San Antonio and Albuquerque is the other. I'd also want to encourage folks on this call, if you haven't yet registered on RadioSpark, if your organization is thinking about applying, RadioSpark, or even if you're just an organization that would like to be part of an effort, and you may not necessarily officially be part of any, RadioSpark is a great place to connect with other groups that are in your region, that are in your community, or maybe even not even in your community, but that are interested in applying or that are interested in being part of that effort in some way, shape, or form. RadioSpark is a place where you can go, sign up, and just check out all the wealth of information that's being exchanged there. So I highly encourage you to do so. For potential applicants, there's an applicant profile there that you can kind of fill out and share a little bit more about you. And this will be helpful further down the line when you need further assistance, further technical assistance that folks like Prometheus and other groups can provide. Which brings me to my last point, which is the Torchbearers program that Prometheus started. And it's a program to provide more hands-on, one-to-one service for potential applicants. So it's a highly subsidized program. I think each potential applicant pays about $200, and they get biweekly check-ins with someone that essentially case manages their application. They get support around filling out the application. They get some initial support around engineering, and they also get some referrals to potential engineers that could help do an engineering study further down the line. So I think that's a great resource. I know at some point over the next couple months they're going to be rolling out this program and really looking for folks to sign up for them. So it's something to think about and something to potentially fundraise for. I mean, it's $200. It's a low threshold, and it's definitely a lot of return for that investment. So those are the three things that I would kind of bring up as next steps. I wanted to kind of take a step back and with the last couple minutes that we have, just see if anybody else had any other questions or comments that they wanted to share. Okay, hearing none, I have thrown up my contact information on the visual format of the webinar. Please feel free to reach out to me around any questions that you have or any resources that you'd like to share with other folks. My goal after this webinar, and it's a little late on the East Coast, so I may need to get to this tomorrow morning, is to share some of the various different resources I was talking about during the webinar, like the fundraising toolkit, and I'll share a governance toolkit that is also available, and a couple other resources for you all. The other thing is, Magnet, in our role helping to do outreach around this, we're definitely vested in supporting groups that are in Magnet regions, and so New Mexico being one of those. I'm definitely on hand to help support in an ongoing basis as I'm needed. If you want to think through any kind of organizing challenges, or if you'd like to think through, an agenda for a meeting or events and what have you, I'm more than happy and open to support you all in that process. Once we get into the technical side of things, I may have to defer you to other folks that have a little more knowledge than I do. But at least for now, our interest in this work is to really support Magnet groups that are interested in taking advantage of this opportunity. So my contact information is up there. Reach out to me, please do so. And this was a pleasure to have you all on this webinar, and I had a fabulous time hanging out with you all this evening.
Bye.